Well, good morning, afternoon, evening. So, I'm not sure how much background that we all have on ethics, but the first chapter of the text, the readings for this unit, um, I think could use a little bit of explanation from the background. So, excuse my kind of cheesy setup here, but I'm trying to kind of emulate a whiteboard because I want to get out a couple of principles. The first couple paragraphs talks about the word global, and it's interesting, isn't it? How, like, if you read that first chapter, it's doing nothing really but trying to define a couple of seemingly innocuous terms like global and ethic. But when you really start to unpack them, there's some confusions. So the word global is kind of meant in two senses, right? In terms of world and in terms of earth. This distinction actually comes from a guy named Martin Heidegger. And the idea is that the world is a human construct. And so the deal is, it's when we think about the world, we don't think necessarily about something physical. I mean, yeah, we're thinking about, the earth and whatever the case is, right? But the idea is that human beings create worlds. So we go in and, like, okay, I'm looking out my window here and I see the neighborhood, right? And there's all these houses out there and roads and cars. So human beings have a concept in their mind about what they want the world to be like. So we go out and we shape the world, right? So we create it. And so it's through things like language and culture, as well as our science and technology, that we sort of, as Heidegger says, we create a clearing in the forest. And we impose our way of being onto our physical realities, and we create worlds. So everywhere you go in terms of world is humanly created. Now the earth is the non-human, I guess we could say. So what we mean by that is just the earth itself, right? So think of it physically. I mean, yeah, there's animals and plants and stuff, but it's like, the raw, I don't want to say raw material because that makes it think like the earth is just there for our consumption. But I mean, well, non-human, I guess is the best way to put it. So think of it more like the physical, right? Because we got to be careful, because everything, even, by the way, let me apologize in advance if the dogs bark. They're laying down beside me now. But everything interprets the earth a little bit, I would assume, right? Like there's a world of dogs. The way dogs understand the earth is different than the way cats understand the earth, right? So I guess they too make worlds, but I don't want to complicate it even more. But the point they're trying to make is, as this applies to global ethics, so the worlds that we construct are about, our global cultures, how we get together. Do we consider humanity as one thing or distinct things, right? Whereas the earth is more about sharing of resources, physical resources, and that kind of stuff. So, I guess if we had to simplify this as much as possible, when we think world, think culture. And when we think earth, think physical. I think that's the easiest way to describe it. Another important thing, I'm looking at my notes here, and that I would highly suggest, folks, here I got as I was reading through the text, right, I've got my notes and I'm making notes as I'm going through. Highly suggest you do that, because when you write things down, it sticks in your memory way better, because you have to focus much more on something when you're taking notes. And so it's a much better way to understand and remember. But I know it's old school, but old school is not always bad. Anyway, another important distinction they made in there was ethics as between what they called like small e ethics. Can I go like this? Yeah. And then ethics, the discipline. And small e ethics is, how we use the word ethics in everyday language, right? When you're talking to your buddies and stuff. And usually when we say, oh yeah, man, that's a very unethical, or that person's not very ethical, or whatever, we usually kind of have an assumption that we bring into consideration. And when most people start talking about, being ethical and unethical, what they're really doing is kind of advancing their own values. And so when someone says that situation, it's an unethical act, they're not really deliberating and thinking about ethics as, different principles. They're just sort of like throwing their concept of small e ethics onto something. So it means more like an opinion almost, really. But then ethics with a capital E refers to the discipline. And that's, what our course is all about. And there's 3 general fields in the discipline of ethics, which originated from philosophy. And those 3 fields are meta-ethics. I'm just going to get them down and then we'll talk about them. Normative ethics and applied ethics. Okay, and so here's kind of how it goes. So meta-ethics really asks the questions of what is the origin of ethics. And it kind of comes down to what's the ground for which we could even argue that there should be some sort of ethic, right? Dogs, for instance, you don't find blameworthy, right? If my dogs make a mistake, I'll get angry sometimes. Oh yeah, like my one guy likes to chew up books. And so even though I try to keep the door locked in here, sometimes I forget he'll come and chew up a book. And I'll get angry, but I can't really throw an ethical, rule or perspective or principle on my dog because the dog doesn't think along those lines, right? So what is it within human beings that even makes us understand something like should and should not, right? Wherein lies the origin? Some people would say that it's in our human reason. So that would be the likes of Aristotle and those kind of guys. Some people would say that it involves our emotion or intuition or something. And that's a whole branch of ethics called sentimentalism. And some people would say that it is simply in our sense of pleasure and what we want, which would be appetites, which would essentially be almost hedonism. So the idea of where does ethics come from? That's meta. Meta simply means beyond. That's all it means. So it's really beyond ethics because we're not talking about what or what is not ethical. We're first asking, well, in what field do we even put the discussion? Normative ethics. Norma comes from, it actually means in Latin, a type of ruler that carpenters used. So normative ethics is about creating standards. So this is where we get into, the should and should not, right? Now, the thing about normative ethics, though, as a discipline is we are after discussions that would found these standards and shoulds. So it's the debating process, basically. From normative ethics and standards will come rules and regulations, right? So, for instance, if you sit through HR, seminars at your work or something, those aren't really ethics; those are rules, right? Because ethics always involves debate. That's the whole thing. Because what we're doing in philosophy is we're not saying, here's what you need to do. In philosophy, what we're saying is, here's one perspective on what you need to do based on these reasons. But people disagree, right? And so in normative ethics, there's all kinds of different things. We are going to, I'm going to change my color. We're going to study things like deontology. This comes up in chapter 2. Consequentialism, virtue ethics. Are we getting into virtue ethics? I think so. And contractualism. I'm just going to go contract. And so these are all examples of normative ethics because they are a perspective that says, because the world is this way, because human beings are like this, we should act like this. But they all differ, right? They disagree. These are different ethical theories that are trying to establish a norm. And again, I know we live in a society that says, yeah, we got to be careful about normal. There's no normal anymore. But there has to be normal. Because if you're going to park your car on my lawn because you don't believe that there's any rules or there's no norms or anything, then we got a problem, right? If you believe that it's perfectly fine to, mutilate people to death, we got a problem, right? So the word norm is not a bad word. You cannot have a community without norms, right? So, but the trick is, how do you do it fairly, right? That's the whole thing behind normative ethics. And then finally, applied ethics. And in applied ethics, we can get into business ethics, we can get into environmental ethics, etc. Obviously, the one we're doing is global. And so that's where our course is located, right here, as a field of applied ethics. Now, within, global ethics as a field of applied ethics, we will get into some normative stuff in terms of backgroundy, because you got to inform somehow your discussions of, the application. Because if you don't have a theory, what are you applying? Right? So applied ethics always has to fall back on some theory as well. Okay. And I think that's good. You know what, though? There's another thing that we want to talk about here, and that's the distinction between global ethics and global politics. Well, political, what do they call it in the text? Political ethics, or international ethics. I think they call it international ethics. So let's go intel for international. So in global ethics, we're after judgments, right? That's the whole thing about ethics. We are after judgments. And should we judge people? Absolutely. I know it sounds mean, and we might think, how dare you judge? No matter where you are, left or right, whether judge not lest you be judged, or don't judge, my truths or whatever. The point of the matter is, we have to judge, right? Like, here as I pick up my coffee, I have to judge, is this coffee or is it rat poison? I need to make a judgment, and I need to discriminate too, right? And I have to judge between good people and bad people. We don't want to be mean, but are there bad people? Of course there are. We would disagree as to who is good and who is bad, of course. Unless we get a sense of, unless we agree on a normative ethical theory, and then we can decide who is good and who is bad. But we do need to judge. That's important. But the trick is to judge fairly and accurately. That's what philosophy is about, right? Okay, so in ethics, we're always judging, which means that we're after what is right and wrong on a global level. That's the shtick. And the thing is, when it becomes global, one of the things is, right, and this is in the background of this whole course, is that we've realized the entire Earth is connected, right, in ways through, climatology and environmental ethics. Even the trees, they had no idea that, the current understanding of forests is that the whole forest, the trees are all connected and actually communicate and stuff. We used to have no idea about these sorts of things. So where the global judgment comes in is, it's not so easy today to say like we used to some years ago, well, that's how you do it there, this is how we do it here, right? Well, no, because if you do something here that is bad for the environment, it does affect me over here, right? And so now our judgments of right and wrong have to take a whole new perspective. But we still have to make such judgments because if you are polluting a river that's destroying an entire community, we do have to pronounce a judgment on that, but we also have to have an ethical argument as to why it's wrong. Okay. Whereas global political stuff is about, here we go, more about regulating the effects, regulations, and the effects of the effects of the ethical norms and considerations on states. So this would be a little bit more kind of legalistic and policy related, whereas this would be, a little bit more, ethical, right? Anyway, those were some of the important themes in the first chapter. And so hopefully we have a sense of, what global ethics is all about, because as I was just stating, I mean, really, there's always been ethics trying to be universal, right? That's always been the case. But what's beginning to happen now is that our actions, and that's the chapter suggests, even in the bedroom, right? You would think that something so private about, our, stuff between our intimate partners, it does have global, repercussions. You could think about, population and all that kind of stuff. So what we do in our microcosms affects the globe. And that's why we have this field of global ethics, because it's kind of like a recognition of that level of things. Anyway, I hope this little backgroundy stuff kind of helps out. I'll try to pop on every once in a while and do little things like this. And if you have any questions, let me know.